Happy Wednesday, Dog Nation. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Harrah's Cherokee Casino Resort. A lot of fun for us in the program. I really love playoff rankings, even the ones that don't matter kind of at the beginning of the year. So I had a good time with what went down last night, especially seeing Georgia probably at least a spot higher than I thought it would be. I assumed that Oregon was going to be the top-rated one-loss team. Georgia got that nod over the Ducks last night, probably with good reason when you look at the overall criteria all the way around. We'll talk about that some on today's program. We'll start getting ready for Missouri a little bit, kind of a weird update from Tigers coach Barry Odom about the status of his quarterback, Kelly Bryant. Our buddy Mike Griffith going to be with us. We will talk about what I thought was the bigger news from the playoff selection committee last night, and it actually doesn't involve Georgia. So we'll try to touch all of those bases, and our buddy Connor Riley is going to join us for two reasons later on. And I mean, it's part of our regular broadcast here today. Reason number one, he had the best seat in the house, so to speak, for a pretty touching moment between Kirby Smart and Jake Fromm at the end of the Georgia-Florida game on Saturday. He'll tell us about that, and he was also an eyewitness to the debut of Anthony Ant-Man Edwards last night's segment Coliseum. So we'll try to touch all of those bases here today. Really glad to have you with us. DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Harrah's Cherokee Casino Resort, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Harrah's Cherokee Resort. Find us online at Caesars.com/Harrah's-Cherokee.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So a lot of you kind of know this about me, but it's probably worth saying all over again. At my essence, I'm kind of just like a big kid, right? I mean, I like for life to be as fun as it can possibly be. I think sports are supposed to be as fun as they can possibly be. I think sometimes we all are a little guilty of taking this kind of stuff a little too seriously. That's why we didn't observe a 24-hour rule here on this show in terms of celebrating the win over Florida. I know life is worth celebrating. Big wins over a rival are worth celebrating, and kind of doing that for more than just one day kind of felt like the right thing to do. In the same way, when it comes to the college football playoff top 25 rankings, we know on their substance and their essence, they're not really all that important. That ultimately, it's how you play over the course of the final month of the season that'll determine if you're a playoff team or not. We're all obviously aware of that, but I think that the ratings themselves, even like the first week's worth of rankings, I think they're kind of fun. I like the debate that it starts, even if it's kind of like a practice debate for the real debate that'll matter later on in the month of November. I'm talking about at the end of this month. I just kind of like the whole thing. So last night, I'm kind of laying on the couch. I'm a little bit sleepy because, I don't know, I guess I'm just getting to be that much of an old man, but I'm just kind of sleepy on the couch. Rankings are coming out at the halftime, or should I say in the sort of in between the two college basketball games last night, and you see Georgia end up at number 6. Now, I predicted on yesterday's show that I thought that Georgia might be more like number 7, behind Oregon maybe. When you listen to the criteria, it probably makes sense that Georgia is where it is. But here's the point that I'm kind of getting to. This is what I thought was fun. So the selection committee's got that big full screen thing they use. You get the top 4 teams here, and you got number 5 and number 6. It was kind of cool to see Georgia on the first page of the rankings last night. Now, listen, Georgia staying there and then climbing that is going to be determined a lot by kind of how it plays the rest of the way. We obviously know that, but thinking about where Georgia has been and how much consternation, probably a bigger word than I should be using, how much consternation's been out there last couple of weeks about, what is Georgia and what's wrong with Georgia and this and that and the other. To see Georgia start the playoff rankings within shouting distance of being in that top 4 right there on that front page last night, I have to say, even though it doesn't really mean anything, it was at least a little bit fun to see. I had a good time with that. I also enjoyed Mike Griffith's piece at DawgNation.com, where he had a chance to catch up with Rob Mullins, the College Football Playoff Selection Committee chairman, as far as why is Georgia led the way in terms of the one-loss teams, why Georgia seemingly gets the nod for right now as the top one-loss team. I thought this was pretty interesting from Rob Mullins. You can read this in a story from Mike Griffith at DawgNation.com. Mike will join us in a minute, but let me read this to you now. What Rob Mullins says is, Georgia has beaten 2 top 15 teams, number 10 Florida, number 15 Notre Dame. They're the only FBS team not to give up a rushing touchdown, which is a pretty strong statement, Mullins says. They have an experienced quarterback, elite running back, but the separator for them at this point was the 2 top 15 wins. Now, that's really interesting to tout Georgia for that, given the fact that there are a lot of teams rated ahead of Georgia that can't really make that same claim right now. Clemson, probably the reason it was number 5 in the rankings last night, but also Alabama too. Alabama doesn't get the nod ahead of a team like Ohio State, ahead of a team like LSU right now. And I think the issue facing Alabama is also the lack of those kind of top 15 wins. In fact, one of the stats you see thrown around a lot today is the total combined record of all the teams that you've beaten. The total combined win-loss record, which is not the best way to rank strength of schedule, but for this particular instance, we'll kind of go with this. The total combined win-loss record for Alabama right now is not really all that good. So Georgia does have that going for it in a way that Oklahoma probably does, and in a way right now that Oregon doesn't. Oregon has a quality loss, but in terms of its quality wins, may not quite have that, and Rob Mullins touts that for the selection committee right now as the reason why it has Georgia number 6. But the thing that you also heard Rob Mullins say there is, how about that rush defense? Not allowing a rushing touchdown all year long. And when you hear Mullins say that, you can't help but kind of hearken back to where we were during the summer. And for those of you that listen to DawgNation Daily, presented by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort each and every day, you heard me back during the offseason say, hey, Kirby talks about have it great, but y'all don't forget about this rush defense. Wasn't great for Georgia a year ago. Be careful with that when you go into the 2019 season. If I could have fast-forwarded then to now, first committee announcement, hearing the selection committee chair say, boy, we're really impressed with the Georgia rush defense. That's one of the reasons why we think Georgia belongs in the top of the conversation for the college football playoff because of how good its rush defense has been. If I could have known that then, I would have been feeling pretty good about the 2019 season, and here we are now in the month of November, and because of the Georgia defense, you do kind of feel pretty good about this, all things being equal. However, it is kind of also interesting here that when Rob Mullins says one of the main reasons we had, or among the reasons we had Georgia ranked number 6 last night, best one-loss team in America at the moment, is because it has not given up a touchdown on the ground. Same day, a couple hours earlier, Kirby Smart talking about the same subject. Hey, what have you done this year with your defense schematically to prevent rushing touchdowns? Kirby apparently doesn't think the lack of a rushing touchdown for Georgia is quite a big a deal as the College Football Playoff Selection Committee chairman does. So when Kirby was asked about how his defense is keeping guys out of the end zone, listen to how Kirby kind of downplays this all the way around. This is actually pretty interesting.
No, we haven't changed much philosophically. I mean, we've added some things to our package that have helped. We've played well in the red area. Some of that's just a statistical just draw. I mean, we've had some plays score from outside, the red area on some big passes that maybe those drives turn into a goal line possession and they score. I mean, it's a great feat to have, but I would trade some goal line rushes for some not big plays. You know what I mean? And I'd much rather not give up long passing plays. But the guys are proud of it, and they try to own it. And we work hard to keep people out of our end zone. And we've always said to get in our end zone, you're going to have to throw it in to try to make them one-dimensional, but it doesn't always happen that way.
Now, generally speaking, I think that Smart's probably correct about that it is probably just a statistical anomaly. However, it's also interesting to point out how much of an anomaly it's becoming. I saw ESPN Stats and Info last week said that you've got to go back at least 20 years, which is as far back as their stats go, to find a team that's gone this deep into the season without allowing a rushing touchdown. And if you want to start stretching it even beyond this, if Georgia could somehow finish the season without giving up a rushing touchdown, I believe there are only 2 teams in the history of college football, and these are all like 100-year-ago type teams, only 2 teams in the history of college football that have gone an entire year without giving up a rushing touchdown. So Smart, for the most part, I believe is correct. It's more of a oddity than anything that's really the bedrock of what's made Georgia successful, but it's kind of amazing how odd it really is getting and how much of a rarefied air that Georgia is in overall. But obviously stopping the big plays may actually determine your wins and losses maybe more so than anything else. But the fact that Georgia has not just been good at not yielding rushing touchdowns, but good against the run overall, I do think that's a bedrock principle and one of the main reasons why Georgia can arguably say that it's the best one-loss team in America. So kind of an interesting contrast to what Rob Mullins said about rush defense compared to what Kirby Smart said about it. But as far as the overall rankings overall, Kirby Smart also talking about that subject last night. He said they're very important. You should watch them closely. You should debate them intensely. Actually, that's not what Kirby Smart said at all. That's, I'm sure you probably already guessed. Here's Kirby again.
No, I don't have any. I mean, I'm not even the least bit. I'm so tied into what we've got this week. I don't even think about that. I have no idea and don't care because everybody knows it doesn't matter. I mean, what matters is how we play against Missouri is the only thing we can control.
Yeah, so listen, as the coach of the team, that's obviously Smart's job to kind of downplay all of that. Luckily, around here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort, we get to have a little bit more fun with it. And so, obviously, I do like the debate that comes up, and I like to hear some folks touting Georgia again after a couple of weeks' worth of kind of the opposite from a lot of the national media. Before we change the subject, let me kind of squeeze in one more point on this. This is also probably ultimately not all that important, but I thought it was at least a little bit interesting. Sports Source Analytics, which is the data service the committee uses to the extent they use any data whatsoever. But Sports Source Analytics is the service they contract to provide them with statistical information. They tweeted something out this week that I thought was kind of interesting. So here are the teams who've been in the college football playoff rankings the most. We're now working on year 6 of the playoff era. So Ohio State, Alabama, and Clemson have been in each and every one of these. Oklahoma's been in 30 of the 32 rankings thus far. Georgia right now, last night, entered the rankings for the 20th time in the 32 weeks worth of rankings that's been done. So if it can stay in the rankings, obviously expects to, it can move past Auburn pretty soon. They're at 21. Believe it or not, Mississippi State's been in the rankings more than Georgia. They've been in the rankings 22 weeks out of the 32. Obviously in 2014, Mississippi State was a pretty good team. LSU been in there a little bit more than Georgia. You forget that 2015, 2016, those were years that for the most part, Georgia just wasn't really a part of the college football playoff top 25 conversation. But obviously they've been a fixture in that role since Kirby Smart's become head coach. So we are now in the part of the season where people start really trying to figure out who those top 4 teams at the end of the year are supposed to be. We've always known that Georgia would be in as long as it won out. Not every good team in college football can say that about it themselves right now. So from that standpoint, Georgia's in a pretty good spot, and with wins over Missouri and Auburn and Texas A&M, Georgia Tech, and then maybe an SEC championship as well, Georgia can be in an even better spot by the time the final rankings come out a few weeks from now. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort. Good to have you with us. Live on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Or on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. Had a chance to be with my friends on the radio there this morning. Always love making a stop by there on the morning show on 960 The Ref. And, of course, for those of you listening to our podcast, whether it's the Apple Player, the Google Player, or the world-famous DawgNation.com, just really glad to have you with us. And, of course, really glad to have Harris Cherokee Casino Resort making it all possible. You know, they've got 2 great casino resort locations, and they're both very close to Atlanta, about a little bit less than a 3-hour drive. Whether it's Harris Cherokee Valley River, which has like an unbelievable gaming area, nice hotel, or whether it's Harris Cherokee Casino Resort, which is the original location that's got like 1,100 rooms, 10 dining options, world-class spa, great entertainment, unbelievable gaming area. Really, whichever one of the Harris Cherokee Casino Resorts you choose is going to be a great place to stop by. And one of the things that we're really excited about is, by the end of the year, the fact that the book is going to open. I'm talking about sports gaming coming to our friends at Harris Cherokee Casino Resort, both locations there. You can go have a good time, watch the games in a kind of a luxury sports book venue, and then also get some action down on the games. This is great. If you're watching a video, you see the website. It's kind of a mouthful. Caesars.com/Harris-Cherokee/casino/the-book. Now, I'm sure you maybe, if you're listening radio podcast, you didn't get all of that. The good news is if you just simply search Harris Cherokee Casino Resort and the book, sports book, you'll get to go right where you need to go, and that's just really, really exciting to have that coming to Harris Cherokee Casino Resort. All right, let's go around the doghouse here for a moment. It's brought to you today by our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and turn your attention now somewhat fully to the Missouri game coming up on Saturday. And is this gamesmanship? Is this something to be aware of? Apparently, Missouri quarterback Kelly Bryant dealing with a little bit of a hamstring issue. He had been banged up already a little earlier this year, but I believe at the time he kind of played through that. But after coming off a bye week last week for Missouri, apparently now maybe that's a little bit of an issue. Barry Odom was asked about that going back to his press conference on Tuesday, and kind of makes it sound like they're still not quite sure if Kelly Bryant, the Missouri quarterback, is going to be ready to play. Here is Barry Odom and his quarterback.
Yeah, I would say sitting on Tuesday, I thought he did some things today much better than last week. I also know that the efficiency on how you can play that position and what it takes. If we played today, he wouldn't be out there. We'll take it day to day. I think he is a fast healer. I've learned that. I know he was anxious during practice today to do a lot more So we kind of edged it on and had him do more than maybe I anticipated going into today. He'll do more tomorrow, and then we'll take it from there.
So I don't quite know what to make of that, other than the fact that Barry Odom's just shouting to the microphone as if he was a carnival barker. But other than that, I'm not quite sure what to make of that. I'm assuming that what Odom says about Bryant is pretty similar to what Saban has said about Tua Tagovailoa and pretty much what every coach says about his injured quarterback. My assumption is that Kelly Bryant will play on Saturday, and that I used the phrase gamesmanship before. This may be a degree of gamesmanship from Odom when he talks about Bryant. One thing is for sure, before this recent spat of losses for Missouri, they were scoring a ton of points. As recently as a couple weeks ago, they were averaging like 38 points a game. They're kind of riding high going into Nashville. They lost to Vanderbilt. I thought for sure they'd bounce back against Kentucky. They had a history of doing that. Did not bounce back in that game. Gave up a lot to Lynn Bowden and the Kentucky Wildcats here. This is a very difficult Missouri team to figure out, and that's before you get into a potential injury for Kelly Bryant, which I'm assuming is probably being made more of than it actually is. This is a Missouri team that's played very well at home, been kind of rough on the road. Obviously, Georgia fans hope to create an intense atmosphere for Missouri's trip here on Saturday night, and we'll see if that streak continues of Missouri just not being able to figure it out away from Columbia here. So that'll be a storyline worth watching. It's Around the Doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And when I talk about ESOG, there's a couple of words that you hear me using a lot. One of those is solutions. Solution to a problem is really important. And some things when it comes to the things that Engineered Solutions of Georgia knows the best, cracked foundations, water coming into your house, kind of a wet spot in your basement, any kind of waterproofing your foundation issue. Sometimes those solutions, believe it or not, are actually not all that complicated. It can be kind of a simple fix. And if that be the case, then ESOG is going to tell you exactly how to fix it. But let's also be honest, when it comes to a crack in your foundation or a waterproofing issue, sometimes the needed fix is a lot more substantial. If that's the case, it's another reason to choose Engineered Solutions of Georgia, because they have 2 full-time engineers on staff. They do really quality work because they are experts in the field. As much expertise as you can possibly have, full-time engineers doing this kind of work for you. So my advice to you is, if you've noticed a crack that makes you a little nervous, I'm talking about, one of those deals in your foundation, if you see some water coming in, or if you see a wet spot that may indicate some water has come in, don't hesitate to reach out. Dial this number. Dial 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. Dial that number to get in touch with my friends of Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and they will give you a fix to the foundation issue or the waterproofing issue you might be dealing with. All right, it's DawgNation Daily. It's presented today by Harrah's Cherokee Casino Resort. We've got more of my thoughts and the rest of the committee playoff rankings from last night. We'll do that a bit later on. But for now, let's find out what Mike Griffith thinks here as a part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Harrah's Cherokee Casino Resort.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Mike Griffith had a chance last night. Talked to Rob Mullins, College Football Playoff Selection Committee Chairman. Good piece at DawgNation.com. Hope you'll check that out. Hope you will read that for yourself. And I guess, Mike, let me get your thoughts on this. I was actually, from a Georgia fan standpoint, pleasantly surprised to see UGA at 6 last night. It doesn't really matter. I'll keep saying that over and over again. But in terms of what I thought the committee might do, I thought they might reward Oregon for having played Auburn on a neutral site, and I just thought that they might show some love to another conference. To see Georgia on the first page of those rankings last night at number 6 right now, kind of holding the mantle of top one-loss team, at least for the moment, I thought for Georgia that was a pretty good thing, and a far cry from where things were in terms of the conversation around the program about 3 weeks ago or so. So kind of a nice night for the Dogs last night. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, it's so political, OPA. I mean, Rob Mullins is the athletic director at Oregon. So he's not going to, Oregon's not going to be ahead of Georgia after the junk they pulled on Georgia last year with the Georgia AD on that, the Oklahoma athletic director on that committee. Florida and Georgia. Look, these guys are aware. They're very aware that they got called out for leaving Georgia out. And the thing of it is, there's zero transparency. We have no idea what they're stressing in the end. There were a lot of good points made. Why is Alabama in the top 4? If you're going to look at schedule strength, if you're going to do eyeball tests, it's a whole different matter. But I'm with Kirby Smart on this. It doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. It's interesting. And it's something for us to talk about, but the reality of it is it would be very, very hard, not impossible, but very, very hard for a 2-loss Georgia to get in the playoff, even if they were to win the SEC championship game.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think we're in a situation right now where it's kind of crowded at the top, where a 2-loss team might be crowded out just because of the way the conversation, the narrative is going to move. But you mentioned Alabama. I'm going to do more on this later on the show, at least briefly. I thought that Alabama was one of the real stories last night, not so much for where they were ranked. They are in the top 4, and as we keep saying, ultimately that doesn't matter. But what does matter is the discussion that forms around them. And I've heard a couple different voices in the sport. Feinbaum comes up, a Herbstreit comes up, and they both have essentially said the same thing, which is that if Alabama were to lose to LSU on Saturday, it's likely eliminated from the playoff discussion. Now, those are just opinions, but when two different ESPN guys express the same opinion, you kind of wonder, okay, is this coming from somewhere? Is this the stats and research department kind of pushing this? Is someone pushing this on them? If I was an Alabama fan, I'd be pretty nervous right now because we've treated the LSU-Alabama game as if it was the loser's still in great shape to make the college football playoff. As of what the folks are saying on TV last night, and I do take this somewhat seriously, as what the folks are saying on TV last night, only LSU may be okay if they lose the game because they've already collected some impressive wins and they're on the road in this spot on Saturday. Alabama, who has about as weak a resume as Clemson does at the moment, I'm not quite so sure they're going to be treated so well if they were to lose to LSU. This isn't 2017, at least it seems like right now. Did you kind of come up with the same conclusion?
Well, I remember that, Paul and Kirk Herbstreit both also said Georgia should have been in the playoff last year. So, and they were, they were on the wrong side of that discussion, as was I. It depends. I think Alabama gets an out if Tua doesn't play or if Tua is limited. Then you go, well, he wasn't healthy. So if you've got a one-loss Alabama that lost to LSU without a healthy Tua, and a 2-loss Georgia team were to beat LSU in the SEC championship game, I could see a scenario where Alabama would go ahead of Georgia. We saw this happen in the Big Ten, 2015, when Penn State won the league, but Ohio State was chosen to go, even though Penn State beat them head-to-head. So never say never until this process is transparent, until we know what the metrics are that they're going to be using ahead of time. This is just 13 people sitting in a room that can be influenced and can make their own decisions and make their own rules and decide for themselves. You and I can talk about it. We can rationalize it. We can look at computer polls. We can look at schedule strength. We can look at recent history. We can look at transitive properties. But at the end of the day, 13 people are going to make a decision. They're going to pull the curtain, and they're not going to tell you why they pick who they pick.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously their criteria seems to change from year to year, which has always been my biggest problem with it all the way around. It's Mike Griffith here as part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort. Let me also tell you about this before we get more questions with Mike, including a look back at the big win over Florida. Next week is a big week for DawgNation because we make a return to the Marlows in Brookhaven. Now, the address for this is 3575 Durden Drive Northeast. Please write that down. 3575 Durden Drive Northeast. It'll be myself and John Stinchcomb. We'll be there. It's Thursday, November 14th, starting at 6 p.m., getting ready for the Georgia-Auburn game that Saturday. Probably plenty of look at kind of how the selection committee might be treating Georgia and kind of how things are all playing out. It's a fun time of year to talk about all that kind of stuff. Recruiting stuff always comes up. We have these conversations there as well. It'll be a live broadcast, a fun kind of wide-ranging, free-flowing Q&A with all of you. The Brookhaven location, always one of our favorites. So we'll see you next Thursday. That's a week from tomorrow, 6 to 8 p.m. at the Marlows in Brookhaven, 3575 Durden Drive Northeast there in Brookhaven. Can't wait for that. John Stinchcomb's excited about that. We hope to see all of you there for that one. All right, Mike, let me transition and talk a little bit more about Georgia-Florida here for a moment. And my overall takeaway on this game is that ultimately it plays out very similar to how I expected it to. I feel like there are probably still a couple of questions that Georgia needs to answer. I feel like there are probably still some issues facing UGA in terms of ultimately being one of the 4 best teams in the country at the end of the season, but I never thought Florida was good enough to exploit what might be an issue for Georgia. I always thought this was a good matchup for UGA. Kirby's handled Mullen. We certainly chronicled those statistics. The talent edge favored UGA in this game, and we made that pretty clear for months and months and months. So ultimately the Georgia-Florida game wasn't all that instructive for me about how the rest of the season's going to go, because I just think that Georgia has an edge over Florida. Ultimately, what was your big takeaway from the Dogs and the Gators?
Well, just the validation of Kirby Smart's philosophy. I mean, Look, I know that a lot of people don't like the style of football that Georgia's playing. They would much rather see the pinball effect that, Alabama and LSU lighting up scoreboards. But that's not how Kirby Smart, the GM, built this football team. He put pieces and parts together to build Georgia into this automobile. It is what it is, okay? It is what does Kirby endorse? What kind of pickup truck? I forget. Is it a Ford or a Chevy? Whatever kind of pickup.
Well, we're not giving a free plug, whichever one it is.
I'm sorry, what is it?
I said we're not going to give them a free plug, whichever one it is.
Okay. Georgia is a four-wheel drive pickup truck. Okay? They're big, they're practical, they can give you payload, they got a loaded cabin for riding comfort. This is what they are. This is who and what Georgia is. And the pieces and the parts, the players that make up the wheels and the hubs and the engines and the transmission, they were recruited to build this product. They were recruited to play this style. You're not going to flip a switch and turn them into a Corvette. They're not built that way. So Georgia needs to do what Georgia does well, because this is how it's built. Now, if you want to go out and transition this program into a spread team, it's not going to happen. You're not going to start all of a sudden recruiting 285, 290-pound linemen that can get out into space and block in open spaces for the screen game or the quick pass game. Kirby's not going there. That's not how this team is built. And I think it's a good formula to beat a spread team. I think we saw that last year. I think we saw that the last two times they played Alabama. They had Alabama beat. If Georgia executes, it's not like Georgia, played their A game and lost to Alabama. No, they failed to execute. Rodrigo Blankenship missed a huge 30-yard field goal. Huge. If he makes a 30-yard field goal, Georgia beats Alabama last year. The year before, if the senior safety plays his assignment, Georgia beats Alabama. Failure to execute. Not a failure in scheme, not a failure in philosophy. Failure to execute. Execute the plays, and Georgia has won and a chance at 2 national championships. Not a matter of scheme or philosophy.
So the only thing.
So I took it away that Kirby Smart was validated. This is the style. I don't think it's going away, B.A. And I think the players are bought in, and I think Kirby won back some of the fan base with that win over Florida.
All right, so so here's what I'm going to say in response to all of that. Obviously, I don't think anyone wants Georgia to wholesale change the things that it does because, as you pointed out, what Georgia does well, it has a tendency to do really well and has done that for a number of years. However, I think it's important not to read too much into what happened versus Florida in terms of how you would potentially beat a team like Alabama or a team like LSU or a team like Clemson or a team like Ohio State, because Florida is vulnerable to the things that Georgia does well. It's not as good along its lines of scrimmage, not as good at stopping the run, not as good at trying to run the ball. Even fast forward a couple of weeks from now at Auburn, a team that has a better defense than Florida does, not a very good offense necessarily, but a better defense than Florida does. I think a game like that, it's a little tougher to win that game playing the way that you mostly did against Florida. Obviously, there were some big-time throws, especially on third down from Jake Fromm. So the thing I would respond back and say here is that you are always, if you're Georgia, going to be able to beat Florida doing what you did on Saturday. But that doesn't change, for me, the overall equation against the best teams in the country, and Florida's not one of those. The best teams in the country who are more dynamic on offense, you're going to have to match some of what they do in those games. And when a really dynamic offense is coupled with a really dominant defense, especially with the front seven, especially along the line of scrimmage, it's also important to have a counterpunch to go along with the haymaker that you throw really well. So from that standpoint, the Florida win for Georgia, I think, is one really worth celebrating. But it's not necessarily one that you can extrapolate a lot for when you talk about playing better lines of scrimmage later on in the season. Georgia still needs a little bit of an extra wrinkle, I believe, when it plays some of these teams upcoming. The Florida win is great, and it keeps Georgia involved in the national championship. But the way that you beat Florida, the ease with which you made some of that look, is not necessarily going to translate to some of the other teams that you might play.
I think that's fair. I would point out, though, B.A., that Florida leads the SEC in backs with 29 in takeaways, and Jake was still able to throw 30 passes for 279 yards.
Yep.
So it wasn't like Georgia didn't throw the ball, and it's not like Georgia is not a throwing team. They're a balanced team. They don't want to throw 40 passes. They don't really want to throw 35. but they do want to have balance between the run and the pass, and they want to be able to do both effectively. Part of the way they protect Jake Fromm from the number one sacks team in the league, or any other good front seven they're going to face, probably Auburn, is to run the football. And if you can run the football successfully and stay ahead of the chains, you don't end up in 3rd and 7 or longer where those defenses can tee off on your quarterback. So you have to have some semblance of a run game to have a pass game, if that makes sense. If you don't run the ball effectively, and all you need to do is look at Florida. Florida's inability to run the football was what enabled Georgia to get to Kyle Trask and give him trouble, because Florida was not able to stay ahead of the chains. That's why going into the fourth quarter, Florida was 0 for 5 on third downs, and Georgia finished the game 12 of 18 because Georgia had the ability to run the football. They're not reliant on the pass game. That's all we're saying here. And then as far as formation goes, you're not going to go 4 or 5 wide. Sometimes you're going to go 2 tight ends. Sometimes you're going to go big line, because Georgia has the best offensive line in college football. I believe that. They were back intact for the first time since the first game of the season. So I would agree with you that the Florida game plan is not necessarily what's going to be Alabama or LSU, but I would also suggest that Georgia has the personnel and the style of offense and a pro-style offense that they can adapt to different types of personnel, whether it be Auburn with their powerful defense and a lack of offense. Maybe Georgia goes a little more conservative there, or whether Georgia needs to open it up, as they have the last 2 times they played against Alabama. I think Jake Fromm's played pretty good football, especially last year.
While we have time, let me squeeze in one more thing with you. When it comes to Missouri on Saturday, I'll admit I'm not exactly sure what to expect. This is a team at one point in time that seemed like a sneaky tough game on Georgia's schedule, but Missouri's been just awful on the road. Wyoming, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, not exactly the murderer's row of road games. And Missouri's played terrible in all 3 of those games. This is still a team that can score. I'm assuming that Kelly Bryant's healthier than Barry Odom's letting on right now. Do you have a handle on what you expect from Georgia, Missouri on Saturday?
B.A., Missouri they are the mystery box team. They really, you just don't know what you're going to get when you reach in there. Is it going to be a lump of coal or gold, or, they won the SEC East Division twice? What are you going to get? We don't know, but here's what I do know. And you said this earlier, and I thought that this was a salient point. Where Georgia needs to get better is being consistent. Georgia has had a bad habit this season of playing down to the level of their opponent. That shows me that this team still has room to grow and mature. That is a leadership issue. I did not see that in 2017. Let's face it, 2017 is the standard. They may not have came around with the big prize, but they were the best team in college football. This team does not yet measure up to 2017. You can say they got more talent. I know Pollack said that earlier. You can say they're deeper. You can say Jake's a third year. This team does not measure up to 2017 because they are not consistent and because they play to the level of their opponent. You realize they have not won against Power 5 teams this year. They don't have back-to-back double-digit wins.
Yeah.
They've been up and down and hot and cold, and it's leadership. And Kirby can talk about having great leadership. I'm sick of the talk. Let's see it on the football field. Let's see Georgia go out and look like a top 10 team in consecutive games instead of holding your breath one week and celebrating a big win the next. When Georgia can show that consistency, then we can talk about what the college football playoffs really mean. Because right now they haven't shown me they can play 2 good games against Power 5 teams back-to-back.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to frame what might happen on Saturday. Good stuff, Mike. We always appreciate your time. We'll look forward to reading you more on DawgNation.com throughout the week. And, of course, talking to you here again on DawgNation Daily, presented by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort again very soon as well.
Appreciate it, B.A.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, interesting stuff from Mike Griffith, and I don't think it's incorrect to say that Georgia showing some consistency on Saturday is a pretty good reason to tune into that one. Obviously, Dog fans will be tuned in anyway. But showing a little bit of that consistency, seeing some of that on display, I think there's a pretty good chance that Georgia's ready to do that. The line certainly seems to suggest that. They've kind of climbed the ranks here. I guess this thing opened around 14.5, depending on where you looked at it. You probably see it more like 18 now, and that's probably in keeping with my feelings on that, too. We'll have more on that, of course, later on throughout the week. For now, though, let's get ready to take a cruise around the SEC. And as we go cruise around the SEC, it's brought to you by our friends at Royal Caribbean, which is 50 years bold this year. Now, by now, I know you know how much I love Royal Caribbean. How could you not? If you're watching on video, those beautiful waters of the Caribbean that Royal Caribbean takes you to, and, of course, Perfect Day, Coco Cay, which is a completely reimagined private experience exclusively available through Royal Caribbean. I'm talking about whether it's the chill side of the island or the thrill side of the island. You've really got something for everybody when it comes to Perfect Day Coco Cay, which is an exclusive experience you get only through Royal Caribbean. Also, as a way of celebrating being 50 years bold, Royal Caribbean is, kind of amplifying a lot of their ships that I've been on that look completely different than they did when maybe I sailed on them years ago. So a unbelievable way to celebrate what is a tremendous thing. Since 1969, Royal Caribbean's been kind of redefining what it means to have a cruise vacation, and it's only getting bigger. It's only getting better. The first Quantum Ultra ship is on its way, Spectrum of the Seas. You really need to check out the website. It's actually kind of a fun way, and I'll probably get you in trouble, but I'm going to say this anyway. It's kind of a fun way just to kill some time at work. Go to RoyalCaribbean.com and just kind of shop all the different options of the cruise ships you can go on, the cruise vacations you can enjoy. It's a great way to kill a little bit of time. But when you're ready to get more serious than that and actually book one, talk to the travel advisor near you or go to RoyalCaribbean.com. They can actually recommend a travel advisor for you there as well. All right, let's do a few SEC see-through stories here as we go cruise around the SEC with Royal Caribbean. Let me start with the rankings from last night. I said this to Mike Griffith a moment ago. I do think that the Alabama story here is a little bit interesting. It kind of reminds me, and I don't want to over-dramatize this, but remember back in 2007 when Georgia at the end of the season thought it was going to move up into the top 2 of the BCS rankings, but all of a sudden you started watching TV and everywhere you turned, somebody was saying, well, it can't be Georgia in the top 2. They didn't even win their own conference. They didn't even win their own division. At a certain point in time, enough people said that it kind of calcified. I'm not quite so sure you don't see a similar thing going on in Alabama right now. Alabama's not going to be one of the top 4 teams in college football unless they beat LSU, because look at them thus far. Who have they beaten? And really, when you look at those numbers, really kind of hard to their schedule for Alabama is worse than you think. The Ohio State schedule probably better than you think. You're thinking about the only top non-conference game they played is Cincinnati. Cincinnati is ranked, but other than that, the Ohio State schedule much stronger than the Alabama schedule is right now. Alabama getting beaten up on for its schedule a little bit, and this to me feels like it's the kind of thing that's going to stick to the Tide unless they beat LSU coming up on Saturday. Clemson, of course, would seem to be the team that got dinged by the committee last night. They're in the top 5. Dabo Swinney this week talking about the SEC, basically making the comparison between the ACC, which nobody beats Clemson, to the SEC, in which he says nobody beats Alabama. It's not quite that simple, though. People are very much aware of this. Now, Clemson's going to be in the playoff if it wins out. We know that. But people are just aware that it is an easier ride to a national championship when you're not facing a juggernaut of a schedule. It just is. Doesn't mean that Clemson hasn't been an elite team. Doesn't mean they might not be an elite team this year. The point is we don't know yet. They haven't really played anybody. And when they get to that top 4, knowing they haven't had to be involved in quite as big a stress test to get there, I do think is an advantage overall. A couple other quick stories here for a moment. I believe 24/7 Sports reported this first. I hope I'm giving correct credit here. But Chris, is it Bleach? I'm not quite sure how you say his last name. But a guy who had been starting on the offensive line for Florida seemed to be in danger of losing his starting spot and has apparently decided to enter the transfer portal. Obviously, I love laughing at Florida about this, losing a starter to the transfer portal during the season. However, there's also a part of me on this that's going to say, it is not good for college football if a coach, and I don't like Mullen, y'all know I don't, but if a coach can't even bench a guy who he feels like needs to be benched without worrying about that guy then leaving the program, that's not good for college football. We put a series of rules in place that protect the players. At some point in time, we may need to think about a series of rules that protects the institution of college football, because the way it is now, that ain't it. Let me do 2 other things here real quick for a moment. Theo Johnson, UGA recruiting target. I'm sure we'll do more of this on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger later on today. But Theo Johnson has announced his commitment date. We'll show you that here on the screen. Getting ready to make that just coming up in just a couple of weeks. He says 18/11/19, which must be how Canadians say dates. November the 18th is when he's going to do that, so pay close attention to that there. And then one more thing. I thought this was interesting from Kirk Herbstreit on Twitter, saying that he's talked to former Oklahoma coach Bob Stoops, and he says, this is Herbstreit, reports that he's a candidate for the FSU job are not accurate. He says he's not a candidate, and then he added that he hasn't even spoken to anyone at Florida State. Peter Burns from the SEC Network even added on Twitter a little bit later on that he's not even so sure those XFL contracts have an out. Like, you can't get out of those contracts maybe because of the way that Vince McMahon signed those. That could be worth paying attention to. That's Cruise Around the SEC. It's brought to you by our friends at Royal Caribbean. And I'm going to get Connor Riley here in just a moment. We're going to talk about a couple things with him, including being up close and personal for the really fun ending to the Georgia-Florida game on Saturday. Before that, let me say a quick word here on behalf of our friends at the UGA Alumni Association. So you can stay in touch with everything going on with UGA when you go to this website, uga.edu/update. uga.edu/update. That is the best way to stay in the know about all the opportunities to socialize, network, and volunteer as part of the UGA Alumni Association. This is not just for professional networking. It's really for making lifelong friends, people who have a connection much the same way that you do. As a graduate of the University of Georgia, you can find out about the really cool things happening with your school and the really cool things that the Alumni Association is doing to help make the next generation of UGA grads just as happy and successful as you are. The website to go to here is it's actually alumni. Let me make sure I give the right thing here. It's alumni.uga.edu/update. Let me do this one more time. alumni.uga.edu/update. Stay up to date on everything happening there with a UGA when you check that out. One more time, alumni.uga.edu/update. All right, it's DawgNation Daily. It's presented today by Harrah's Cherokee Casino Resort, and our buddy Connor Riley is back with us here today after having been out and about the last couple of days. And Connor, there are two things here real quick I want to talk to you about. First of all, welcome to the program. But second of all, you had a chance on Saturday, and we've got great video. We're going to show you this if you're watching on video, and if you're normally a radio podcast listener, it's probably worth checking out. The celebration that happened after the Georgia-Florida game on Saturday I thought was really special and, as a fan, fun to watch, but poignant also probably with the way that Smart and Fromm greeted each other after that was over. The video you're watching right now you shot, so that gives you an idea of how close you were to all of this. What was your takeaway from having spent some time around that?
I think it was like a dad, hugging his son, and just immense pride sort of beaming from Kirby Smart there. Kirby's been an emotional guy post-victory before. You remember him yeeting in the locker room last year after beating Florida.
Who could forget?
You even saw him doing some of that this year, but I think that was just a very different display of emotion than we're usually seeing, the usual high energy fist bumps and screaming and shouting and whatnot. That was, sort of a different level and shows, I think a real bond that goes beyond the game of football between a coach and a quarterback who, Jake's, he was even in the midst of that, Jake was pretty even keeled, the same emotion we see from him all the time. But, Kirby, I think really went to a place where he showed just how much Jake Fromm doesn't just mean to the Georgia program, but means to him in particular, because Kirby in postgame, and Jake revealed this as well, that, they had a couple of lunches because Jake's not a guy who, wants to pout or complain or really talk about things when they're not going well, and Kirby just wanted to make sure that he was on the same page. And I think Kirby was very well aware of the perception about Jake that was out there right now, and for Jake to go out and play as well as he did, I think didn't just mean a lot for this Georgia team, but meant a lot for Kirby as a guy who, is trying to, dispel this notion that Jake Fromm isn't good.
Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. I know that narrative kind of gets spun after the game, but, you obviously talk to Georgia fans all the time. Isn't a lot of this, though, on the basis of how Fromm has been chosen? I mean, I don't know that the fan base overall has been that hard on Fromm all the way around. I think franchise quarterbacks get a lot of attention. Fromm gets a lot of attention. I think it's interesting that they were as emotional about this as they were, and that Fromm and Kirby did allow the fact they had some lunches here this week, because I wouldn't describe the treatment of Fromm as especially harsh. I think question with the Georgia offense maybe so, but the treatment of Fromm I wouldn't describe as especially harsh.
I don't know. I disagree with that. Fromm took a lot of flack. There were a lot of weird questions being asked about him, and the line that Kirby and they sort of had after the South Carolina game was just a 4-turnover game.
Yeah.
It's hard to win in general when that happens, and I know you choose not to believe this, but the Kentucky game, it was raining incredibly hard, and it's very hard to throw a football in that weather. And a lot of people don't want to believe that, but I had that line after that Kentucky game, and just I think that was more a poor weather game than maybe necessarily an indictment of Fromm's abilities. But I do think there was a piece of The Ringer yesterday sort of ranking the top draft quarterbacks, and Fromm came in third. And one of the things they point out there, like, if you just go on to Twitter and search Fromm sucks, there are tons of Twitter responses out there, both from Georgia fans and from non-Georgia fans.
Yeah.
So I do think that they were Kirby in particular, very aware of the criticism around Fromm and this team, and I think he, in his post-game, sort of fired back. He said, I appreciate the fan support, even the ones who think that Jake Fromm can't throw.
And I thought that was probably a mistake on Kirby's part. But, overall, I think what you hope is that the confidence that Fromm displayed on Saturday and the poise that I think he demonstrated throughout really the entirety of that game, and the specialness of this moment with Fromm and Kirby after the game, I think what you hope is, and I think you have reason to believe it will be true, is this becomes a catalyst for the rest of the season. Boy, Georgia, the offense is beautiful when it's play action pass. When it's set up the run, then play off the run to find a wide open Lawrence Cager. Dan Mullen made a point of saying, their 2 touchdowns were busted coverages. It's kind of funny how busted coverages seem to happen when a smart quarterback and good athletes are executing a play action pass. Boy, you'd love to see that become a springboard for what Georgia does the rest of the season.
Right. And, Jake's, an even-keeled guy, and I think, I think, again, the South Carolina game is just sort of to use the word Kirby uses a lot, a misnomer as to what Fromm's ability is. It's the only game all year he's thrown an interception in, and he just happened to throw 3 in that game. I think the quarterback, it is very weird. So the last 4 games, the sandwich, the 2 games in the middle, Kentucky and South Carolina, admittedly were not great games by Fromm, but the bread, the outside, is a nice sourdough or a nice pumpernickel, whatever you prefer, because that Tennessee game and that Florida game, he was exceptional in both of those.
Before we say goodbye to you, let me also touch on another subject here for a moment. I know you had a chance to be at Stegman Coliseum last night for the debut of Anthony the Ant-Man Edwards. I watched most of this game on streaming video last night. The SEC Network Plus had this. I was incredibly entertained by it. I wasn't always sure that Georgia was going to win the game. For a while, it seemed like they might not, pulled away here late. But Edwards, I thought for the most part, was as advertised. I thought the Georgia team, it's just a much more fun brand of play. And I'm not quite so sure this is a tournament team at the end of the season. I think that still remains to be seen. But in terms of being worth your attention when they're on TV, like last night, or at least streaming video, seemed like the crowd was kind of in the game, into the game, pretty full all the way around. Georgia basketball is a much more entertaining product right now. I think Edwards is a big reason for that. And that, for me, is a win, even if the March wins don't exactly come this year.
I think my big takeaway from last night is that Edwards is capable of doing anything on a basketball court, both, good and sometimes, because, again, it's worth remembering, he is not, freshman sometimes is not necessarily accurate for some of these guys because of the way they reclassify in their age range. Anthony Edwards is a legit 18 years old. He just turned 18 back on August 5th, as Tom Crean so often likes to remind us. And, I think last night you saw an array of things. You saw, he was being very handsy on defense. He had 4 steals in the game. He had a couple of nice assists and was finding guys out in transition with great lead-out passes. His jumper is good enough to where he can pull up and shoot over you, and he is confident enough in his jump shot, and he made a few big ones last night to where he is a threat to score from anywhere on the floor. But we also saw he struggled to finish in transition last night. He got in foul trouble. He ended up fouling out of the game. So he had a missed dunk or layup where I think he tried to lay it up and just couldn't decide whether or not he wanted to dunk it or not. But the exciting thing with him is that truly anything is capable of him on a basketball court, and Georgia has not had a player like that in a very, very long time, certainly not in my lifetime.
All right, good stuff there from Connor Riley. I thought it was a lot of fun last night, and I can't wait to watch this team play again here coming up pretty soon. Before we get ready to say goodbye, make sure you check out DawgNation.com here today. Go up to the very top. You'll see really interesting new news from Kroger, getting you ready for the holidays here. And by the way, taking a lot of the work off your plate. Holiday fresh meals without heat or preparation with the help of Kroger and Home Chef. You can choose from ham or turkey plus all the sides, including stuffing, rolls, casserole, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, and more, and it's just $70. It's a great deal. You can order online, over the phone, or at your local Kroger deli. And by the way, if you want to get this in time for Thanksgiving, last day to do that is November the 25th. So you got a little bit of time to do that, but get in before November the 25th. To get those holiday meals kind of served right there for you, or, delivered right there for you and taken care of for you so you can have a less stressful holiday season, Thanksgiving included. That's certainly a good deal. Check out DawgNation.com right there at the top for more of our friends from Kroger on that. All right, as we get ready to wrap up here today, and, it's been fun to hear from so many of you over the course of the last few days about how much fun it is to have the Gatorade Updater back in our lives again. for another full year. We love counting this thing down. We love having a good time with all of that. A Gator Hater Updater now stands at a robust number here as we get ready to move in. How about 1,103 days? That's 1,103 days. That's how long it's been since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. And we're going to love watching that number keep climbing throughout the year. We think it may keep climbing for another few years there as well. So we're busy on the rest of the week here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort. We got a lot more on Georgia, Missouri throughout the week. Kind of an interesting game there on that front. Also kind of more on the playoff positioning for UGA. And keep your eye on Theo Johnson. Big announcement for him coming up pretty soon here as well. Thanks for being with us here today. DawgNation Daily, presented by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort. And on video, Connor, if you want to stay with us here for a little bit, we'll kind of be quick with the comments and let you get on with your day after that. We got a nice little window here. We can do almost 20 minutes or so with those. So why don't we get ready to do that, and we'll kind of knock out as many of these as we can on both Facebook and YouTube. Good to have Connor as part of our regular broadcast, sharing his thoughts and getting a chance to be up close and personal with Fromm and Kirby on Saturday. And I thought the debut of Anthony Edwards last night was really fun. I actually got a chance to, spend some time with Edwards going back to I forget when it was, summer, winter, whatever it was. But a really interesting young man, I feel like. The kind of guy that you can obviously understand why he's expected to be successful in basketball. And he's not just a good player, but he seems to be just a guy that's kind of, taking all of this in stride, not going to be overwhelmed by any moment. Certainly not a college debut against Western Carolina. So I think he's pretty interesting right now, and I think it was really fun to watch him there last night. So let us talk about some comments here. Funny thing from Kathy Aquavia Green. Apparently, the fact that we have a R.S. Andrews cool down that extends beyond the regular show, she said it took her a while to figure that out. That's kind of interesting. I didn't realize that. By the way, speaking of our friends at R.S. Andrews, don't forget our buddy Dari. Keep him in your prayers. Got a little bit of a medical thing that he's dealing with this week, so we'll welcome him back here pretty soon. But also, make sure you check out R.S. Andrews for your air, heating, plumbing, electric needs, especially this time of year when it comes to the furnace system. Is it safe? Is yours safe to make its way through the cold weather season to come? Well, R.S. Andrews can give you that mega safety check, and you can make sure they're timely, well-trained, screened, clean techs will show up to your house, and they'll give it everything that you need to make sure your furnace is ready to go for the winter to come. It's rsandrews.com for a lot more on that. We'll get a comment here and we'll kind of get rolling. Miriam Martin Corbin says, I'm not standing for anybody downing my quarterback over it. I understand, Miriam, where you're coming from on that. I think also when you're Jake, when you're 13 years old, you're going to be a high-profile quarterback. And I just think it just kind of comes with the territory. There's going to be, a lot of attention, a lot of people saying things. I think that the bowels of Twitter probably aren't a very good gauge for anything. And frankly, I think the comment sections can kind of work the same way sometimes. As much as I enjoy the comments that we all have here as part of the R.S. Andrews cool down, I don't know that someone spouting off something in a comment section or someone spouting off something on Twitter, I don't know that's a very good temperature gauge for the feeling of the fan base at large. I mean, you see countless examples of this. If you program a show to please Twitter, you're going to ultimately fail. If you establish a political campaign on the basis of what Twitter wants you to do, you will ultimately fail. I mean, Twitter is not real life, and that's true in college football there as well. Let me get Adrian Carver on this, and I'm going to get Connor Riley's thoughts. She says, did y'all see Dabo Swinney throwing shade at the SEC teams in the college football playoff, saying no one in the SEC has beaten Bama? His point is that while his team is undefeated, they are ranked number 5 because of their weak schedule. Dan Mullen or Dabo Swinney, biggest whiner. Yeah, Adrian, I agree with you. I think that is whining on the part of Dabo Swinney. Dabo, the argument that works for him is that Clemson has been an elite team. And likely, I think they're still among the elite teams this year. Remains to be seen if they're among the top 4, but in the elite team conversation, Clemson's still there. They clearly proved that last year. They have beaten Alabama. But, Connor, I will admit that I'm kind of with Adrian on this. For Clemson not to pretend they are not somewhat benefited because of an easy schedule, that's disingenuous, and I can't abide that. I actually like Dabo a little bit, but I can't abide this. No one's saying that Clemson's not an elite team, but an elite team playing an easy schedule is a huge, huge advantage.
Right, and part of my problem with the playoff, and because you're going to see this with Alabama if they lose on Saturday, and they go on to win out and they don't play in an SEC championship game, I think when you're those super elite programs, which right now only Alabama and Clemson occupy those spots in my estimation on a year-to-year basis anyway, they're going to get the benefit of the doubt. Like, my advice to Dabo last night would have been, don't say anything. Just wait a week, because one of Alabama or LSU are going to lose, and they're going to drop below Clemson, and Clemson's going to move up to 4. And then in a few weeks, on November 23rd, Ohio State and Penn State are going to play, and one of those teams are going to lose, and Clemson's going to move up again. I mean, I can understand, Dabo's whole, we've proven we can beat Bama, we've proven we can do this in the past, but the problem is, and Kirby Smart has said this week, every team is a new team, and part of my frustration with this college football playoff committee, because I think you've seen it in the past with Alabama, is that they give teams the benefit of the doubt based on what they've done in the past, and that doesn't really have any bearing on this current season.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. However, I am interested to hear you say that, because it sounds like you're a little bit different than me. What I've heard about Alabama over the last 24 hours is kind of sticking with me a little bit. As I said during the regular broadcast, I don't want to over-dramatize this, but the same way the narrative got cast in stone about Georgia in 2007, they can't be in the BCS title game. They didn't even win their conference. They didn't even win their division. I think you're starting to hear some of that with Alabama about who they have played. Now, if they beat LSU, that obviously changes everything. At that
when
point
they
in time,
beat LSU.
At that point in time, they'll be totally validated. But as it stands right now, I feel like this narrative is starting to form around them that they haven't played anyone. And statistically speaking, they haven't. Alabama's schedule up to this point in time has been no more difficult than Clemson's has been. I mean, really, they've been very, very similar.
They both have the same best win.
That's right. And, some of these organizations are kind of combining the win-loss records of the team you've beaten. Alabama doesn't fare particularly well when it comes to that kind of thing right now. So, I mean, you hear Mike Griffith talk a lot. It seems that he has, lots of conspiracy theories when it comes to college football playoff. I think I probably don't trust this group either, but for a completely different reason than Mike does. Ultimately, I don't believe the committee cares who wins a national championship, nor do I believe it really cares who makes the playoff. They care about two things. They care about making as much money as they possibly can and keeping the member institutions happy enough that they don't revolt against the playoff. That's a big part of this. If you want to go back to prior to 2014, you didn't necessarily have great buy-in from every conference in the in the sport because Notre Dame wanted to make sure they were going to be taken care of. The Big Ten and the Pac-12 had this relationship with the Rose Bowl they viewed as special, and it probably was. It's a great bowl game, kind of cool that they kind of had that agreement with each other. They weren't easy to please with this. So if you go another year and exclude the Pac-12, because the Pac-12 hasn't been in the playoff since, 2016 with Washington? They've only been 2 Pac-12 teams that have made the playoff in the 5-year history of the playoff. I think this is going to be one of those years where the Pac-12 champion, and it's going to probably work out where Utah and Oregon's a pretty good game between 2 relatively high-ranked teams. I think the Pac-12 champion gets an extra look because I think you've got to keep the folks who once voted for a playoff, you got to make sure that they want to stay in this playoff. And at a certain point in time, if one of these conferences gets left out too many years, they're going to revolt against it, fairly or not.
Right, and another conference I think that needs to be worried right now is the Big 12. I believe Oklahoma came in at 9th yesterday. And yes, they have a game, or at least one game, possibly 2 games against Baylor, but they, if I'm Oklahoma, I'm rooting for Oregon or Utah to slip up because I think a one-loss champion Pac-12 team is going to get in over a one-loss or at Oklahoma team.
Well, I think it's really telling. If you go back and look at the 5-year history, there has always been either a Big 12 or a Pac-12 team, but we've never had a Pac-12 and a Big 12 team in the same year. I really kind of view this as, there are 5 conferences, there are 4 spots, not counting Notre Dame. I've always sort of viewed this as, in a very rough shorthand, it's going to be ACC, SEC winner, Big Ten winner, with either the Big 12 or the Pac-12 winner. And for the most part, that's kind of the way that it's worked out. So I think it is telling that both Pac-12 teams were ranked ahead of Oklahoma last night. I don't think Oklahoma has a very clear path of getting back in this right now.
And I think Clemson is another team. So, just talking about them, I think last night is a clear indication. If Clemson's getting into the playoff, they're getting in because they're undefeated.
Yeah.
If they lose one game, it doesn't matter when, doesn't matter if it's a conference championship game, they are toast.
Yeah, and the other thing to mention about the ACC, and then we're going to get some more comments after this. the ACC has, for the most part, been a weak league the entirety of the playoff era, but it's always had an elite team at the top. It was Florida State with Jameis Winston prior to that, the final BCS champion. The first year of the college football playoff, it was actually Florida State who made the playoff as an ACC representative. So one of the reasons why I think it's been relatively safe to pencil in an ACC winner as a playoff team is not because of the strength of the ACC, but the top ACC team, because it's often a Deep South team, the top ACC team is usually pretty playoff worthy, even if the league itself isn't exactly the most battle-tested. Derek Tillman mentions the Trayvon Walker situation. Connor, I know you wrote about him this morning. Would you mind just kind of sharing some of your thoughts? What led you to want to write about him? Led you to want to ask Kirby about him yesterday, and kind of where things are with Big 44 right now?
Yeah, well, I asked him about it yesterday, and I'm glad Kirby went where he did with it because he had a huge pass breakup to stop that Florida drive right before half, and that was timely, not just because it obviously forced a field goal there, but it gave Georgia sort of enough time left on the clock to where it was going to have enough comfortability to sort of run its offense and run enough plays to get down there and get a score right before halftime to make it a 13-3 game. And Walker was a guy who, yes, he missed the last 2 games, but this is something I see from a field that it may not stand out necessarily from the stands and certainly not on TV. Trayvon Walker's body is just different. He is the absolute definition of what like a 5-star defensive lineman should look like. It is jarring. Seeing him on kickoff is something I've never seen someone at 290 pounds do before. And, there just are not many guys like him. And I sort of wanted to, as great as this Georgia defensive line has been, it's somehow got a ceiling to be even better as Walker sort of continues to play more.
I think he's got the highest NFL ceiling of anybody on the Georgia roster. And with all due respect to Nolan, I think that Trayvon Walker's at the highest NFL ceiling.
Andrew Thomas.
Thomas is pretty good as well. Thomas is there now, I guess. So it's obviously easy to favor Thomas because he is at that point in his career right now. I guess what I'm saying is, it's difficult to imagine what Trayvon Walker is going to become because I do think, with all due respect to Andrew, I think asking Trayvon to do what he's doing on the defensive line, I think it's a more difficult position to play.
Right, and I think with Trayvon, the thing that Kirby said yesterday, it wasn't, we asked Malik Herring about him, and he just listed, long arms, he's fast, he's strong, and he's fast, sort of the true athletic freak model. But the thing that Kirby said about him yesterday is, he's a guy who, he's a student of the game. He's a guy who, because of his mental aspect, is a guy that wants to succeed. We spent a lot of time preseason talking about how, freshman defensive linemen rarely make an impact. And Walker is sort of bucking that trend. And I think a big reason for that, in addition to his physical abilities, is sort of how he's approached this and handled things from a mental side. He's gladly taken to that role of just, right now being a guy who comes in on third down and just makes life more difficult for the opposing team.
I also think about what the Georgia defensive line could look like, and I don't mean to look too far into the future, but I don't think that Jalen Carter is quite the same as Trayvon Walker. I think Walker is a better prospect overall, but in terms of like freakish athleticism, I think Carter's kind of in that conversation of really wow factor defensive lineman. So if it's a Georgia defensive line that one day looks like a Carter, looks like a Trayvon Walker,
I would mention Jordan Davis here because he is another guy who, he was not the 5-star recruit. I think largely because of his weight. Kirby said because he thought a lot of other teams thought of him as a potential offensive tackle. But man, you just don't see a lot of guys at 6'6", 330 pounds at least, who move the way that he does.
I think that it may one day be almost unimaginable that we used to sit around and say, hey, what's wrong with the Georgia defensive line recruiting? Why isn't Georgia recruiting the defensive line the way that it recruits outside linebacker and defensive back, inside linebacker as well? I think one day that may seem like a foreign conversation, just given how uniquely athletic and deep and talented this defensive line may one day be.
Like if they get Jordan Burch next year, now they're going to lose some guys. Tyler Clark has been really good this year. But if they get Jordan Burch along with Carter and Davis, that line next year is going to be a full-blown problem.
Yeah, no, I think so for a lot of teams. All right, let's do some YouTube comments, although YouTube is just a mess today. Y'all are out of your mind over here today. Mike D, on the subject of Georgia in the playoffs, says teams don't want to play us. We have a defense. Only Ohio State has a decent defense. It goes back to what we said at the top of the show, the fact that Rob Mullins, in citing, his case for Georgia, does mention that lack of rushing touchdown. For the most part, I agree with Smart on this. This is more of a curiosity than it is a actual quotient for the Georgia success this year. But to be as good against the run as Georgia has been, even beyond the lacking of the rushing touchdowns, it does seem like that's Georgia's brand now, right? That Georgia's the defensive team among the national championship contenders. And that's not to disrespect the Ohio State defense, which is really, really good. Ohio State's got at least 2 all-world defensive guys. But it does seem like that Georgia kind of has the brand of, boy, you're going to know it if you play Georgia. You're going to know it if you play that Georgia defense. It does seem like they're the ones that kind of represent the defensive side of the ball in this national championship conversation right now.
It's something we sort of talked about in recent weeks, when the offense was struggling going into that Florida game. I think Georgia wants to zig where everyone else wants to zag. You see everyone going, spread, up-tempo, we're going to try and throw 50 points up on the board. Whereas Georgia is very much more we're going to take you out of your comfort zone, we're going to make you grind out a win. You're going to beat us by running the ball. It's not going to be because you're throwing the ball all over the line.
Yeah, one of the things that I do get a little frustrated with sometimes is, even my good friend and colleague Mike Griffith, is that we have a tendency to want to polarize these discussions and say, well, all you people who want Georgia to be just like, I don't even know who, team Oklahoma, team that throws it on every down. I don't really know of anyone who wants Georgia to be that way. The only thing I've heard people say from time to time is, and certainly the thing that we've said on this program over and over again, is that Georgia, when it faces teams better than Florida, is going to have to be just a little bit different, right? I don't think anyone in this show has ever said Georgia's got to be dramatically different. Georgia's going to be way different. It's got to be just a little bit different. And I don't think that's untrue now that Georgia's beaten up on Florida. This is always going to be an opponent that Georgia kind of knew how to handle, knew that it could handle. And I think the larger truth remains true here is that, Georgia's going to have to be a little bit different when it faces, an Alabama or an LSU or a Clemson or an Ohio State. The good news is, deep down, I think Kirby Smart knows that. I think deep down, that's exactly what Georgia will do. You can go back and look at the game film of last year's Alabama game and see some things that Georgia was doing a little bit differently than it normally does against opponents. But when you play an elite defense, and that elite defense also paired with an explosive offense, you've got to find a way to match a little bit of what they're doing. Not a lot, but a little bit.
This is something you brought up a lot in the offseason, wanting Georgia to go from a team that takes 2 deep shots a game to hitting on 4.
Yeah.
Did you see that against Florida? Did you see enough of sort of that downfield passing?
I did.
I don't necessarily know how many 20-plus yards other than the Cager one that they had, but there were more in that 10 to 15 to 20-yard range.
And I think that's fine. I mean, I think that anything sort of, 20 yards and beyond is fine, right? And I do think that was pretty good. I think that, if you want to like nitpick the Florida situation, you could say we could be a little bit better on second down, but honestly, as good as Georgia was on third down, because it's hard to be that good on third down. Last year, Georgia was not as good third down as they were against Florida. I'm talking about in terms of protecting from, that was one of the areas in which the Georgia offensive line was probably not stellar a year ago, was third down pass protection, but man, it was really something to behold on Saturday, and Fromm is beautiful. Scott Harris says, okay, BA, let's talk Mizzou. We'll get to Missouri for sure on that. We'll get to Missouri. And, Scott, if you've got a specific point you want to make on Missouri, we can certainly do some of that there too. Frank Patterson says Zamir White goes over 100 yards this weekend. I've about been convinced by what Connor said, when we've talked about this before. I think Connor actually makes a pretty good point on this. It is now a situation where while Georgia's not necessarily limiting its bench in terms of who plays, it is limiting its bench in terms of who really gets called upon to carry the load. And right now it's going to be DeAndre Swift for obvious reasons. It's going to be Brian Herrien below that for those same reasons. That doesn't change my overall outlook for White. I think he's among the top players in this team next year. But for now, it could be that he's having his Nick Chubb 2016 year where he's still a little bit limited coming off the knee injuries that he has had. And just given the fact that, for the most part, Swift and Herrien don't fumble, that Kirby's going to, especially in big games, and for the rest of the season, that's pretty much all Georgia's going to play. When it comes to big games, they're just going to trust the guys who are getting it done. You saw more carries for Swift than you typically see a Georgia running back get. Cager was targeted more by comparison than typical receivers for Georgia get targeted. But right now, they're going to lean on their horses, and that's exactly what Cager and Swift are right now, and Herrien's not too far behind.
Right, and Herrien obviously had the great catch. I understand wanting to get the ball to Zamir, and I've trumpeted it as much as anybody, but right now, do you really want to take the ball out of Swift and Herrien's hands because they're playing so well, and ultimately that's the opportunity cost you have to live with if you're giving the ball to White, and right now, Swift and Harrion are playing too well, I think, to do that.
Can I be slightly politically incorrect just for 1 second?
You can always be slightly politically incorrect.
Joseph Kennedy says Missouri, that Yankee team, ain't beating us. I have to admit something here. I've always disliked Missouri because I don't view them as a Southeastern team. And I don't want to get into like long-standing history on this.
Would you like to debate the Civil War?
No, I don't want to get into to long-standing history on this. But I do view Missouri as culturally different than Georgia. Whereas you can say what you want about Tennessee, you can say what you want about Auburn. Florida is kind of its own thing. But when it comes to the Auburns, the Tennessees, the South Carolinas, the world, even Alabama, you may not, and I mean this in the sporting sense, you may not like those people, but you have a decent idea of like what they eat for Sunday dinner and kind of, like what they like to do on the weekends. You feel like you have a decent idea about that. They may be your foe and your rival, but they are culturally your cousin. Missouri, I don't feel that way about, and because of that, I've always disliked Missouri.
I've never, dislike is a strong word there. I think they're watching, Cardinals baseball, and when it's in the off season, Cardinals baseball reruns, obviously. But as far as the cultural fit, I don't know about that. The times I've been to Columbia, I've had a great time. It's a very good college town.
Why are you having to be? Why are you toeing the line on this so much?
I don't dislike Missouri. I mean, there are Southeastern teams that I dislike more. I mean, I've never been a big Tennessee fan. I think they're quite obnoxious. And if you want to go back and look at their Civil War history, specifically at the beginning of the Reconstruction era, I mean that's pretty despicable.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into any of that. I mean, to be honest with you, to further this point a little bit more, I kind of also feel the same way about Texas A&M.
That was going to be my follow-up.
Yeah, just a bit. That I don't really feel that folks in Texas are necessarily cultural cousins to Georgians or the other deep South teams. I feel like the way they treat their high school football there is very different. I've always told you that I think that Texas high school football is totally overrated. And I just feel like when the SEC went from 12 to 14 teams, I understand why you do that from a business standpoint, but the idea that it used to be this SEC chant because everybody sort of felt like they were all in this together, as it is now, it's just a conglomeration of television markets more so than true. Because that's always been more true for the SEC than it is for the other leagues. I mean, the ACC, even prior to the mega expansion, I mean, you had Tallahassee, Florida, and like College Park, Maryland. I mean, those two institutions weren't the same. The fan base weren't the same. Even the Big Ten, you had a pretty good stretch of just different kinds of people, even in kind of like Big Ten country. But the Southeastern Conference is always kind of, hey, everybody kind of has the same outlook on life. When you start adding people from the Midwest and the Southwest, that starts to change a little bit. And I realize that's heavily provincial, but that is my opinion.
Which two teams would you have preferred to be added back the last time around for expansion?
That's a good question. I guess if you're gonna bring in like people that don't have Southeastern ties, then I guess I probably would have said like Oklahoma and Texas, just make the league as big as you can possibly make it.
As opposed to say maybe Clemson and Florida State, who probably certainly fit more geographically or culturally, I would say, than because Florida State to me is more southern than Florida is. Because Florida, Gainesville, you're sort of getting down to Orlando, and Orlando is not the South. Florida is its own sort of subcontinent, but like that North Florida area is very much pretty southern, I would say.
I would say that's probably true. I probably agree with you. I'm not going to say much more on that. But anyway, I've always sort of felt like, and this is a crackpot theory that I have nothing to back up for, I've always felt like that Georgia probably has more in common with Oklahoma, a team that's not in the Southeast, than it does some of those teams kind of near there. For instance, I don't think that Georgia and Texas have very much in common at all. I mean, there's a certain wine and cheese faction of Georgia fans that probably feel like they do. But, for the most part, I always feel like that Oklahoma could fit into the SEC because their fans sort of feel SEC style to me. Mm-hmm. They're whereas some of those, I don't know. I mean, I guess I've sort of always assumed that Oklahoma didn't quite have as many benefactor boosters as like an A&M does or Texas does. Something about that kind of turns me off a little bit. Not that there's any shortage of, powerful boosters here. John Chappell brings up a pretty good point. I can remember hating Clemson more than Florida back when we used to play them every year. John, I lived through that era in the 80s as a child, but you're right. The Georgia-Clemson hate was real back then. It was also probably nice that Georgia was beating Florida every year. Jeff Gubala says, well, Cager's from up north. I guess technically he's from Miami.
Maryland's not up north.
He says, if you didn't have him, it would have maybe 2 or 3 more losses. So listen, I don't think anyone's going to pretend that this is the most logical line of thought. So obviously, I don't think anyone's going to say that all of this is the most logical way to do that. Mark Davis, though, says he told someone from Missouri that they were Yankees and they got really riled up. They don't consider themselves Yankees. Well, there you go on that.
Yankee to me is like Northeast, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and up. Missouri, the border war, it was a conflict state during the Civil War. They don't pass the Yankee smell test to me.
Jose Ortiz says, can we get a big commitment already? I feel like I've waited a long time. You've obviously got, I know there's been some 2021 chatter lately, but you've also got Theo Johnson going on. What do you call it? 18, 11, 19? Mm-hmm. I feel like if that's the way you're writing dates, that makes me very nervous. Is Canada really that different? They don't even put the dates in the right order?
Well, it's how they do things over in Great Britain. So
is that really what it is?
Yeah, they do. In the rest of Europe, it's really America once again that is doing things differently from the rest of the world, where we put the month first and then the date.
But you know what, though? I mean, Canada also tried to usher in the metric system. That was a huge failure. Mm-hmm. They tried to do Celsius, too. Celsius is a huge failure.
I don't know if you can call it a huge failure.
Oh, it's a huge failure.
The entire continent of Europe uses it.
But listen, here's my thing on Celsius compared to the standard system. The standard system is very easy to understand. If it's 0 degrees Fahrenheit, you're really, really cold. If it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit, you're really, really hot. In Celsius, if it's 0 degrees Celsius, you're kind of cold.
Oh, you're cold.
And if it's
32 degrees,
and if
that's cold.
And if it's 100 degrees Celsius, you're dead.
Yeah.
No one can understand that. So I blame Canada for that there as well. Also for ruining bacon. I blame Canadians for ruining bacon. But to be like a total wet blanket on all this, at this point in time, I'm not exactly expecting Theo to be throwing up the G when he commits. And I don't mean to be negative, but I'm just sort of assuming that's not the case.
I'd bring up Cedric Von Granger. All right, Cedric Von Pron.
That's true. I mean, I'm frequently...
and we only have to go back 2 weeks ago. Arik Gilbert, no one thought he was going to LSU, and he picked up that Tigers hat.
That's true.
Stranger things have happened in recruiting.
I think the problem is, and I'm going to leave this at that, while no one knew where Gilbert was going, there was one school people were pretty sure he was not going to. So anyway, all right. So what else is going on?
Would you rather be the number 1 recruit in the state of Canada or the number 1 recruit in the state of Pennsylvania? And I meant country of Canada, obviously.
Oh, Pennsylvania's a pretty good state.
Like, what is the cutoff line to where it is more impressive to be the number 1 recruit in Canada than it is to be the number 1 player in the state?
Probably north of Pennsylvania. You could probably talk about north of Pennsylvania, that being true. By the way, Jay Parker brings up Albert. We'll just call him Albert O.
We're just going to call him Albert O.
So, obviously, Georgia had problems with Pitts. Georgia had problems with Cole Kmet. I do respect the Missouri offense. I think that Derek Dooley is a pretty good offensive coordinator, and I think that Kelly Bryant likely plays on Saturday. The one thing that Dooley has done better as well is they run the ball better now than Josh Heupel did when he was calling the plays there. So I do think stopping the Missouri offense can be a bit of a difficult thing. I also think that the way that Missouri has played so poorly with its road games, I do think it makes it difficult to know exactly what to expect from Missouri on Saturday. I guess all things being equal, I'm assuming this is a spirited Georgia performance on Saturday. And while, Albert O certainly has been a load, a tight end like that has been a load for Georgia to deal with, one way or another, I don't expect a letdown performance from Georgia. I really don't. I was not probably all that high on the Dogs going into some of its recent games before Florida, but I don't necessarily expect a lethargic effort from UGA. At one point in time, we sort of thought about this as kind of a letdown type game. I would be shocked. I mean, shocked. Like, force me to reconsider some of the things that I think I know. If Georgia in any way looks let downish against Florida, I just don't see it coming. Against Missouri, I just don't see it coming.
I think with Missouri, so one, we talked to Malik Herring yesterday, and he revealed, so last year against Georgia, they had Drew Lock, obviously, but the Tigers ran for 180 yards and 4 touchdowns in that game. And Malik Herring told us last night that they've got GAs, going around at practice holding up signs of 182, which is how many rushing yards they had. So I don't think even if Kelly Bryant was healthy that they would be sort of sleepwalking or overlooking this game. And I actually think because of the fact that this is a 7 o'clock game, a night game, I don't think it's going to be sort of that same sleepy environment that it seemed like there was there for South Carolina.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Now, somebody mentioned this in the comment section on YouTube a moment ago. Cassie Belleville says the tight end only had a good first half against UGA, then it gets quiet. Komet, that was certainly true. He had 7 in the first half, only 2 in the second half. Did Pitts have a second half catch against Georgia?
Not.
So the one thing that does scare me about that a little bit, though, if I'm Georgia, is that eventually the way that you shut those guys down, I'm assuming, is involving personnel. Either you put a faster guy on them or you bracket them. That's kind of what they did with Komet, for sure, against Notre Dame. At a certain point in time, you're going to run up against a team that's going to make you pay for that. Now, honestly, I don't know what the Missouri receiver situation looks like now post Elijah Moore and some of those guys who've been there in the past. But at a certain point in time, if you're having to send a safety up to compete with a tight end, it's not going to be too long before a offensive coordinator sends a receiver behind the safety that you're sending up. You got to be really, really careful with that. So while it is good that Georgia has figured out ways to stop these tight ends, the fact that you have to throw extra bodies at getting that done is going to be a vulnerability at some point.
Right, and we talked at halftime of that Florida game, and for as well as Pitts was playing, Florida only had 3 points at halftime, and I said to you, maybe you just let Pitts, keep doing what he's doing, and force them to have Kyle Pitts come out and beat you, because I don't think Florida clearly wasn't going to beat Georgia anyway, but I don't think Florida was going to be capable of beating them if they were just sort of trying to funnel the football to Kyle Pitts, or as Missouri will try to do, Albert O for the entire game.
I mean, largely speaking, I think what Kirby Smart said earlier is right, that if you could ask your defense to do one thing, completely limiting big plays, I'm talking about, really, really explosive plays, would be the thing to do overall there. And Georgia, even when it's given up some tight end yards, has been pretty good at doing that. Let me get a couple more YouTube comments, then we're going to go to Facebook. We're going to get ready to get off the air. Green Soldier says, why has Missouri traveled so poorly? Anyone? Turnovers? Just bad play overall? I haven't really watched them yet. I have watched them some. Some of the road games, I guess I ended up seeing a little bit less than others. I watched them a lot against South Carolina. I thought this looked like a really good team. I guess in a roundabout way, Green, I don't really know. I really don't know why they have played as bad as they are. I assume, though, when you have such a disparate level of performance, my assumption is it goes back to coaching, right? I mean, how can you not blame this squarely on Barry Odom when you just look like such a different team away from your own stadium as opposed to your stadium? It's not like that Farrat Field is some house of horrors. Missouri probably has less attendance than any team in college football, in the SEC. Any team in the SEC right now. I think that Vanderbilt may be outdrawing Missouri right now. Missouri's had games this year with like 20-something thousand people in the stands. Their attendance, because you got to remember, most of the teams that Vanderbilt plays have about 30,000 fans they bring with them now. But anyway, it's not like they have some great home field advantage. I mean, Connor, do you have an answer for why they've been so bad on the road? I know Kirby was asked about that this week. He said he basically hadn't paid attention to it.
So I know the last 2 games, so Kelly Bryant had that knee injury he suffered earlier in the year. Now he ended up being fine. Or he's ended up playing through it, but I do think injuries have started to get to Bryant a little bit, and I think that's part of the reason the plays fell off. I would also bring up, that Kentucky game was played in a pouring rainstorm, and Missouri admittedly probably didn't have a great game plan, and to your point, that goes back to coaching of sort of adjusting to weather that was that bad.
Yeah. So I think it's been very, very odd. Scott Harris says, how good's the Missouri defense? It used to be really good. Yeah, I mean, they've lost a lot in recent years, and are just now having a hard time replacing those. Like even guys like Terry Beckner gone. Obviously for a long time it was like Charles Harris and Michael Sam, and go back years ago, Sheldon Richardson. That pipeline of like really good defensive linemen just isn't quite there anymore, is it?
Missouri is second in yards per game in the SEC, second in yards per play.
So obviously the number's pretty good there, but that's also opponent influence.
Georgia's the best team Missouri has played by a very wide margin to this point.
But in terms of like the game-wrecking first-round guy that they had for just years and years and years, that for the most part, I guess, has kind of gone away. Jose Ortiz says C.J. Stroud or Carson Beck. Obviously, I'm going to take Beck on that, but I am interested to see what goes down with Georgia and Stroud. My assumption is Stroud's going to end up going somewhere else. But I think that Georgia's only talking to Stroud about being a second quarterback. I don't believe there's any Georgia's not looking to replace Carson Beck. I think they'd like to sign a second quarterback, and that remains to be seen if Stroud's going to be that guy. I'm assuming he probably won't.
I think the only reason they're out looking for a second quarterback right now is because, after Carson committed, DeJuan Mathis had brain surgery, and, you do have to wonder if Mathis is ever going to be able to play football again, just given the questions or the severity of that injury.
Somebody also asked about MJ Sherman in comparison to Justin Flo. First of all, I don't think that Flo's – I know he's going to visit Georgia. Jeff has written about that for him. But ultimately, I don't think Flo's coming to Georgia. And I think that MJ Sherman – we don't talk about him anymore because he's been committed for 1,000 years. But he's as impressive a recruit. I know he's been injured, but in terms of when he has played, how he's played, and kind of how he talks about his game off the field, I like Sherman as much as I'm going to like anybody. I think that he is a really pretty cool guy all the way around. All right, let's go to Facebook here for a moment. We'll get ready to get off the air for today. Matt Rukavina kind of mentioning back the old era of, this isn't really a Gary Pinkel-style Big 12 Missouri anymore. They run the ball a little bit better. They are a little more tenacious on defense. Obviously, Barry Odom's kind of got that defensive mindset. A couple of years ago, a big loss for the Missouri program. I guess in the transition over to Barry Odom as head coach, they lost Craig Kulagowski, who had been among the most respected defensive line coaches in America. He ended up bouncing around for a little bit, went to Miami, didn't really stick there. Now he's at Alabama. He's actually out at Alabama now, too, so he's lost 2 jobs here pretty quickly. Pardon me on that. But for a long time, he was just a fixture. And all those great defensive line that Missouri had for years and years and years, he was very instrumental in all of those. Let's see what else on Facebook here. Kathy Garner reminding us that Georgia was the first SEC team to play Missouri. That 2012 game where Sheldon Richardson had said the thing about Georgia playing old man football. Georgia won that game convincingly in Columbia, Missouri. Georgia's never lost in Columbia. Won a kind of thrilling game there in 2016. Won by a couple touchdowns there last year. Did drop the one game to Missouri in 2013, kind of a banged up, injured Georgia team. But it's been a while since that went down. By the way, I know our buddy Santiago Diarn has special interest in the Missouri game there as well. Steve Shaffini, good to have you back in the comments section today. Sounds like he's been working a little bit of an odd schedule lately. Anybody else got anything they want to say before we get ready to go here? Chris Branham's got a fire alarm. He's got to go. Chris, thanks for being with us here. Steve Shaffini says that Missouri's the metric system of the SEC. That's pretty funny. Joey Waldrop says, season over if we lose, period, at least in terms of college football playoff contention. So tangibly, I believe that's true. Now, intangibly, that won't stop me from trying to make the argument on Georgia's behalf, because there's at least a sliver of hope that a 2-loss SEC champion Georgia could work its way in there. So I'm going to reserve the right for myself to make the argument on Georgia's behalf in that situation. But all things being equal, I don't see a 2-loss SEC champion Georgia making the college football playoff. We're somewhat deep this year in terms of the worthy considerations. Assuming Oklahoma wins the Big 12 by beating an undefeated Baylor team, they'll be a reasonable choice as a Big 12 champion, the Pac-12 champion, because you got top 10 teams kind of on both sides of that conference in both divisions. That'll be a reasonable choice. Clemson as an undefeated team feels like a kind of a reasonable choice. You've got multiple SEC teams worthy of consideration. I don't believe we've ever seen a 2-loss team make the playoff. We've been close a couple times, but 2 losses hasn't gotten into the Final Four yet. This feels like a really tough year for that 2-loss team to get in there, because while Georgia will have a pretty good strength of schedule argument, it's not quite as good as it would be for, let's say Texas A&M was this team. A&M playing the SEC West, playing
arguably
Georgia.
The top 4 teams.
Yeah.
Clemson.
If 2-loss Texas A&M was the SEC champion, they got a really strong case because of how tough their schedule's been. Georgia's schedule's tougher than some, but not quite as tough as the very tough.
Right, and do you know how many playoff teams have gotten in to the college football playoff while their one loss has been to a team that didn't make a bowl game? Because odds are South Carolina is not going to do that.
Did Virginia Tech make a bowl game in 2014?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know.
It was Oklahoma in 2016. They lost to a 5-7 Texas team.
Okay. Okay. Well, there you go.
So, as much as we like talking about it, and we encourage you guys to keep, coming back and reading and discussing, the reality is Georgia's got to win out. And I do tend to believe, even if LSU, Alabama, and Georgia all finished with 1 loss, and Georgia by far would have the worst loss of the 3, you're not going to keep a team out that has wins over Notre Dame, who's probably going to finish 10-2, Florida, who probably should finish 10-2, a good Auburn team who would have a win over Oregon, who could be the Pac-12 champion, and a win over what was a regular season unbeaten team in either LSU or Alabama.
Yeah, Wiley Foster says our one loss could be devastating to our resume even with winning out, and I just don't believe that's going to be true. Even though
last night sort of showed that the committee now is valuing good wins better than bad losses.
Yeah, the South Carolina loss is not a good loss for Georgia, certainly, but I really don't think that's going to end up being factoring into this. Because here's one thing you can think of. Remember, as I said before, I'm suspicious of the committee, but sometimes for far different reasons than Mike is. But here's one thing I think the committee will do, and I think it's actually good for the sport they do this. They're going to give Oregon an extra look because Oregon played a neutral site game against Auburn. Ultimately, that's money-making for the sport, but it's also good for the fans to have games like that.
Right.
Georgia played Notre Dame this year. That's not their loss, but they played Notre Dame. I think Georgia gets an extra look because of that. So if it comes down to a comparison between one of those two schools and an Oklahoma that didn't really play one of those games this year, or Clemson, which I guess they play Texas A&M, so they would get the little bit extra nod there. But the point is that Georgia did what it could to make its schedule tougher, and therefore I think they're going to get not penalized too bad for the South Carolina game, but as everybody keeps saying, that's as long as you keep winning.
Right, and I think the thing to look at from yesterday's rankings, Oklahoma, arguably their loss at Kansas State could be the best loss, certainly at the end of the year, especially if, Georgia and Alabama both beat Auburn.
Yeah, Kansas State was 16th last night.
So, but Oklahoma also hasn't beaten anybody, and I think that's the reason they come in at number 9.
That's exactly right.
And, Ohio State, controversial to some for being the number 1 team over LSU. I think if you look at the top 3 wins for Ohio State, Wisconsin, Cincinnati, and Indiana, who is 7-2, those games were all dominant beatdowns, whereas LSU, they won a close game against Texas on the road, and, who knows how good that Texas team is. They weren't even ranked last night. A close win against Auburn, and then, they did cover against Florida. But, I think when you factor in both their resumes and sort of the impressiveness of how Ohio State looked, I think they are a deserving number 1 at this point.
That's exactly right. All right, as we get ready to say goodbye to you, let me say a couple things about the AJC. By the way, it was Election Day yesterday. Lots of races to follow up on. Some of this also nationally there as well. Really good political coverage, no matter which side of the aisle you're on. Really good political coverage at AJC.com. You can check that out. Also, we are on the way towards a little bit of a colder drop in the temperatures for this weekend, including the Georgia-Missouri game as well. You can get some coverage of that at AJC.com here as well. And just a really good look at some of the things kind of going on around some various state parks and stuff like that. Kind of a, fun time. Earlier sunsets, kind of relaxing to be, a little crisper temperatures in some of these North Georgia mountain locales especially. So check all that at AJC.com. There's really something for you no matter what your interests are. And you can check in throughout the day to get the breaking news coverage when it happens. Atlanta News Now at AJC.com. Also, huge thanks to R.S. Andrews, making the R.S. Andrews cool down possible. Whether it's an air conditioner issue or a heating issue, a plumbing, electrical issue, R.S. Andrews can do all of that for you. RSAndrews.com. Have a great day, everybody. I'll see you back here tomorrow, 10 a.m. DawgNation Daily, presented by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort.